In this video, the lobes in the cerebral hemisphere are going to be introduced briefly. The sulci and gyri are to be introduced in the next video. The cerebral cortex is the area for the control of motor activities, projection of sensory systems, complex analyses of environment and self, memory, emotion, personality, judgment, foresight, and planning. The cerebral hemisphere has a convex superolateral surface, which fits to the cranial vault. The hemisphere is divided into frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, insular lobe, and limbic lobe. The frontal pole of the hemisphere is the anterior end of cerebral hemisphere. The posterior pole is occipital pole. The frontal lobe sits in the anterior cranial fossa. The temporal lobe sits on the middle cranial fossa. The occipital lobe sits on the cerebellum. The frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, and occipital bones overlie on the surface of corresponding cerebral lobes. The cortex has inwards folds called sulcus, or fissure, as well as the outwards folds called the gyrus. It is convenient to learn the names of major sulci, or fissures, to divide the cortex into the lobes and gyri, as the functional units. The most obvious one is the longitudinal fissure, which separates the left hemisphere and right hemisphere. In the superolateral surface, the lateral fissure, or Sylvian fissure, divides the anterior half of the hemisphere into the frontal lobe and temporal lobe. The central sulcus is at halfway between the frontal pole and occipital pole. Usually, the superior end of the central sulcus can be found just behind the midpoint of the hemisphere. Not all the cerebral lobes have clear demarcation, as the frontal lobe does. Behind the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. The posterior border of the parietal lobe is an imaginary line between the preoccipital notch and the parieto-occipital sulcus. Its inferior border is, again, an imaginary line which is posteriorly prolonged, from the lateral fissure. These two imaginary lines are, also, the posterior border, and superior border of the temporal lobe. Posterior to the parietal lobe, and temporal lobe, is the occipital lobe. Unlike the imaginary borders on a supralateral surface, its boundary in the medial surface is clearly the parieto-occipital sulcus. The insula is the part of cerebral cortex, which lies deep in the lateral fissure. The limbic lobe, in the medial surface of the hemisphere, mainly consists of the cingulate gyrus and parahippocampal gyrus.